Hello, my dears, and welcome back once again to a Strange Playgrounds episode. Something something. Believe it's episode 15? I'm not entirely sure. Doesn't really matter, to be perfectly honest. I just put these things out as and when I feel inspired to do so. And I've got quite a lot. I've got quite a lot of episodes of Strange Playgrounds in the pipeline because I want to shake up the release schedule of them a bit. I want to do at least one or two a week, at the very least. There's also something else coming down the pipeline. There's going to be a new show that I'm going to be doing with my friend and fellow writer Kit Power, which is it's going to be kind of similar to the Strange Playgrounds, but it's going to be more of a dialogue, and we're going to look at artifacts and bits of media, art, any kind of input basically that stirs emotion, that has some sort of visceral connection for us. And it can really be anything. It can be absolutely anything. That stuff that is formative, I think we both have a particular obsession about, because it seems that whenever we sit down, as you have seen on this channel, if you go and watch our look at the Stephen King books, Desperation and The Regulators. If you go and look at the Binding of Isaac video, if you go onto Kit's own podcast and you look at our discussions concerning RoboCop and Stephen King's It, you will see that there is this very particular fascination that comes up again and again. You'll also see it in the Clive Barker retrospectives. There's this recurrent subject, which is input and influence. It's how input and influence shapes the states of our imaginations, our perceptions, our consciousness. I am perpetually fascinated by that phenomena, and not just on like a neurological level. I have researched how it functions on a neurological level, like the brute mechanisms, the formations of synapses and so on and so forth. But that doesn't really tell you a great deal about the experiential element of it, the abstract element of it. That is fascinating in and of itself, but it doesn't tell you anything about I suppose the more human aspect of it, the abstract element. And that is where my fascination lies, and it's an interesting one because it is a perpetual mystery. There is no way of unpicking or solving that mystery. There is never going to be a clear answer because it's not a clear field. It is abstraction and is therefore it's an arena that is protean by its very nature. It changes under duress. It changes whilst it's under analysis by its very nature. So it is actually unfathomable and an endless mine of matter, of fodder. But it fascinates me. It fascinates me looking back at the delusion of memory, and memory is a delusion. The more I read about it, the more you look into studies into the nature of memory, it becomes very clear that memory doesn't do what people colloquially assume that it does. It is not a record of events. It's more a dream. It's much more like a dream. And the longer ago memories were, the more deluded they become. What happens is the mind embellishes and reconfigures the stuff of memory, and it emphasizes it in ways in accordance with particular factors. So things like bias and intention and the way we want to perceive ourselves or the way we want to identify. That's what happens. Memory is absolutely appalling as a record of events. And that becomes apparent. I mean, have any of you ever done that thing where you go back, say, to YouTube and you search for a cartoon or a video game that you experienced when you were a child that you have very particular memories of, and you come across the image, you come across the episode, you come across what you're looking for, and the actual thing itself is far, far removed from what exists in your memory? That happens to me all the time. It happens to me all the time. And it happens to most people, because the raw fact of the matter is memory doesn't do what we think it does. And that doesn't mean that it's useless or that it's not worth exploring. Far from it, because memory is really, it's the foundation of personality. It's the stuff that informs what we are and the way we perceive the world. But what we do have to acknowledge is what informs us and how we perceive the world is protean. It is not absolute, and it is not accurate. It is not in any scientific or clinical way accurate. It can only tell us about ourselves. It can tell us about the abstractions and delusions of personality that we assume and that we insist upon. And that, for me, is absolutely fascinating, because so much... I mean, I know this is true of Kit from conversations that we've had before. I know that it's true from a lot of people who listen to this podcast. So much of my own sense of personality, my state of being, is informed by media. So much is informed by stories and by art and by music and by comic books and by so many varied forms of image and of contrived thing. And I find that amazing. I find that absolutely amazing, because it means that the stuff of our personalities, the stuff of our states of self, are by their very natures abstractions. They are themselves open to interpretation. They are themselves changeable and protean. So the very warp and weft of the assumptions of personality can be changed. They can be altered. They can be exposed as being delusions. We can have a look at experiences that we considered to be formative and realize that they weren't what we thought they were, or that they can be perceived in different ways. I find this fascinating when it comes to things like relationships, for example. I mean, I operate very strangely on relationships. I'm a very isolated soul by nature. I like being on my own. It's very rare that I have like a romantic relationship going on. But when I do have them going on, I'm very aware of how unlikely they are, and I'm very aware of how contrived elements of them are, and of how ephemeral they necessarily are. What I find interesting is that when people say get out of relationships, I notice there is this tendency for them to exercise this state of self-protective delusion, where they will powerfully demonize the other person. They will paint this picture of the other person as the devil. And it's a way of protecting themselves. It's a way of insulating themselves from culpability, from guilt, from the sense of failure. Because, you know, whenever a relationship fails, you have the death of an intended desire, of an intended life. And that's painful. That really fucking hurts. I mean, everybody, all of us remember the first time that happened to us, yeah? All of us remember, like, just how fucking hurt we were and how the black depths of that experience are unbelievable. And it's always that way. It is often that way anyway. But what I find is that, I don't know whether it's because I'm not always in a relationship. I'm often on my own. But when my relationships have ended, it has never been that way. I've never gone out of my way to demonize the other person, and the other person hasn't gone out of their way to demonize me. It has often been a product of circumstance, not some profound betrayal, not some malevolence on behalf of the other person. It has just been just a natural consequence of circumstance, lots of different pressures acting upon the relationships that have meant that they could not continue, or that they should not have continued. That's another thing. So I do not go out of my way to demonize my ex-partners. In fact, almost all of my ex-partners are still in my life in one way, shape, or form, because they are people who are dear to me. Even if we're not romantically involved, they're people I want in my life. Some of them are some of my very best friends at this point. It's just that the circumstances of our relationships have changed. They've transfigured, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, even though it can be traumatic. Now, the way people generally reconstruct those relationships when they die, when they wither, is amazing to me. I often see people do it. People I like, people who are not terrible people, but just normal people. They will tell me things about the relationships that I know are not true. Because I was there, I was sort of engaged on the periphery, and I know it's not true. But it's not that they're lying. It's that they believe that it is true. It's that this is the way they have come. Their memory has reconfigured itself in order to protect them, to protect some sense of identity, some sense of ego, some sense of pride. It's a very good example of how that works. Because very often, if people are honest with themselves, it is not that relationships fail because the other person was the fucking devil. It's because of circumstance. Sometimes things just end, things just fail, things just were never meant to be. And very often, the circumstances that end a relationship are very complex. They're very complex. People just grow apart, people change, people become distant, people realize that they want something else from a relationship. That happens very fucking often, I can tell you. And that's okay. As traumatic as it is, that's okay. I think it's part of operating as an adult that we need to accept that we need to learn to get over it and to realize that our pain is our pain. It's not necessarily caused by someone else. Not necessarily. It is often a product of circumstance. Very often. Not obviously, not universally. You know, you do get narcissistic, abusive partners. Of course you do. Of course you do. But in everyday normal relationships, when they just fail, it is often not the case that the other person is the devil. It is just a product of the circumstances. And maybe, you know, if we were not swept up in the delusion of romance and love, maybe they should have never been in the first place. That's certainly been often the case with my relationships. You know, if you could resist being swept up by the delusion of romance and of love and whatnot, then you would realize that maybe this is unworkable and that maybe it's not meant to last, regardless of how your mind insists upon it. It's all to do with identity, it seems to me. It's all to do with assumptions of identity and these absolutes by which we love to define, which is part and parcel of the problem of being human. Because these absolutes very often are the sources of our neuroses. They're the sources of all of our despairs and of the cruelties that result, it seems to me. It's because we define in a particular way, and when those particular assumptions or those pillars of personality are assaulted or criticized or come into question, it hurts us. It hurts us on a fundamental level. It's why so many ideological conversations these days are so fraught. It's why they're so polarized. If you go onto fucking YouTube or Facebook or whatever, you will find these they're not debates, they're people shouting past one another. The reason they're so fraught so often is because we feel that both participants, they have interwoven their sense of personality with a very definite ideology or with a label, with an ideological descriptor, like, for example, capitalist or socialist, or with right-wing or left-wing, with this, with that, with whatever. And very, 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 very often, there is some commonality to be had. Of course there is, because we're all human. We're all human, and we all operate under very similar stresses and strains, and very similar pressures. And there could potentially be a more fluid, more protean state, a more experimental state created were we able to talk to one another? Were we able to put down the identities? Were we able to say, okay, it doesn't matter. This tribal label does not matter very much. It is not important to me to define as this or as that. I will entertain this idea. I will entertain that idea. I will attempt to explore them and then determine what is best in any particular circumstance based upon what is reasonable, what is logical, what is evident. But that's very, very hard, especially in the current status. It's very difficult because we do have such extreme ideologies in operation and that are being enshrined. I mean, here in the UK, for example, I fully understand hating the Tory party, the presiding party, and the people who support it. I totally understand. I work in care, for fuck's sake. I work in care, and I'm a writer, I'm an artist, you know? Two areas that the Tories not only disregard, but go out of their way to demolish. Absolutely demolish. But it's difficult. It makes it very difficult because it means that people are forced by external pressures to identify with things they perhaps shouldn't identify with. Like, for example, it seems to be one of the only people who are criticising the current status quo with any degree of legitimacy are people from the Labour Party, yeah? Now, that leads to a situation where you get people who define as Labour voters, and I find that a problem. I find that a mistake. I really do. For me, it shouldn't be the case that we identify with any particular political party. I don't want to do that, or with any particular political extreme. It seems to me that if one thing can be determined to work for the very best, for the widest number of people, then that should be it, and your identity should be regardless of that. It shouldn't matter. But when you do identify as part of this or a part of that, it puts up roadblocks. It puts up roadblocks in your head, so you can't consider that, oh, well, maybe that's a better way to work, or maybe this is a better way to work. And this is also true in fiction, funnily enough. This is also true when it comes to art and fiction. If it's something we find... I mean, I operate in certain subgenres and whatnot, like in independent writing, and what I find that has happened is, although you have this incredible diversification of fiction, owing to the liberation of publishing, basically, thanks to small presses, independent publishing, which, by the way, is where it's going. That is where it's going. It's where the onus is at this point. I foresee a future where there are not big publishing houses. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be too sad about that. I really wouldn't be too sad about that. Bear in mind, it's the big publishing houses that gave us absolute fucking shite like 50 Shades of Grey, that made Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey a phenomena, which, by the way, is an example. It's the best example I can think of how good success, quote unquote, like financial and professional success in publishing or in art is no indication whatsoever of the quality of your output. Really sorry, it's not. It's just not. The fact that the woman who wrote 50 Shades of Grey, which was a fucking fan fiction on the internet to begin with, a fucking Twilight fan fiction, that's how far her ambition thrusted, by the way. The fact that she can now be one of the most successful, like, not in artistic terms, clearly, but one of the most financially and commercially successful writers in existence demonstrates that the quality of work is no indication, or success rather, is no indication of the quality of work. And that's true when you look back. That's true when you look back. Look at H.P. Lovecraft. I've already earned more than H.P. Lovecraft earned on his writings whilst he was alive. But Lovecraft's name and his influence is now so powerful that you literally cannot read not only horror fiction, but almost anything in speculative fiction without feeling his influence. It's amazing, isn't it? Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was not a successful writer while he was alive. He just wasn't. Not in a sort of financial or commercial sense. He died destitute. And yet... well, how many people... there are Simpsons parodies of Edgar Allan Poe. So, yeah, it is no indication of the quality of work. In fact, there is an argument to be stated that often, not all, it's more complicated than this, but often the inverse is true. If something is... Look at, for example, not only shit like 50 Shades of Grey, but look at celebrity books. Look at, like... celebrity biographies, ghost written, by the way. They're never fucking written by the people who claim to write them or whose images are on the cover. They are not. They're ghost written. The people who write those things are jobbing writers, by the way, who are trying to make a name for themselves or trying to at least get some sort of financial support under themselves so they can do what they really want to do. They are obviously wankery. They are self-aggrandizing, self-mythologizing, ego-stroking, narcissistic bullshit that feed into the most hideously banal, corrosive social desires and sort of colloquial desires that are out there. They feed banality. They feed the desire for banality, and they're bad. They are and I don't mean in the sense that I don't like them, therefore they're bad. I don't mean subjectively. I mean technically, objectively. In the same way that 50 Shades of Grey is objectively bad. It is an objectively bad book. That's not to say that you can't enjoy it. That's subjective. I like lots of objectively bad things. I really do. But on a subjective level, if you enjoy it, go and enjoy it. More power to you. But that doesn't have any sway on the fact that it is a bad book. It's badly written. It's badly conceived. It's not researched at all. Like the stuff that the writer explores, the subjects that she brings up, like BDSM, for example. Anyone who knows even anything, and I'm not really like heavily into BDSM culture or anything like that, but I know a little of it. I know people who are, and I know for a fact, even from that sort of peripheral engagement, that what she writes about is fucking bullshit. It is nonsense. It is this simultaneously sanitized form of BDSM, but also misconceived to the point that it's powerfully offensive. It celebrates rape, for one thing. And that is something that you just don't often find in the BDSM community. It is not something that is pervasive within that subculture, because BDSM by its very nature is about trust. Ultimately, it's about surrender. It's about being comfortable enough to surrender, ironically, what we were talking about before, one sense of self, one sense of identity. It's the ability to give oneself up to an imposed identity and finding some sort of release in that, some sort of psychological cipher in that. That's not what 50 Shades of Grey is about. It is, for one thing, it's really terrible titillation. It's badly written on an erotic level. Let's get that out of the way. There's loads of good erotic fiction out there, by the way. Loads of good erotic fiction that is being independently published, that big publication houses wouldn't touch with a barge pole, but which is better than this crap. Way better than this crap. But that doesn't mean anything. That's by the by. It is objectively bad. But yes, it's fascinating to me. It is absolutely fascinating to me that this is the status quo we've come to. This is the status quo we've come to. But raking it back to what we were talking about earlier, what I find in the horror genre is there is this simultaneous liberation and this crystallization happening, like a tribal crystallization, which means that you have certain audiences fracturing, rather than just going to, say, a horror anthology, which will have lots of different types of horror into it. They will go to a horror anthology that's labelled in a particular way and that they think will appeal to their taste. So they'll go to a body horror anthology, they'll go to a speculative horror anthology, they'll go to a cosmic horror anthology, they'll go to a splatterpunk horror anthology. And don't get me wrong, the fact that you can do that is kind of wonderful in and of itself. It's kind of cool, because it means that you can tailor what you buy. It means that there is a way of clearly identifying where these subcategories are and who's writing in them, and of identifying favourite writers. On the other hand, it has this powerfully fragmenting and tribalizing effect, where you get a kind of myopia of subject matter, where people are not being exposed to new things, they're not being exposed to new genres or new types of horror, or of any other kind of fiction for that matter, because they're only going for what they like, or what they presume to like. And very often I've found, certainly as a reader, not only as a reader, but as a media consumer, a lot of the stuff that has had some of the greatest impact on me has been stuff I had not expected to enjoy, or that has come from outside my assumptions of taste, and therefore from outside my assumptions of personality. And that's interesting, isn't it? It's stuff like, for example, I generally like to read, I like stuff that's abstruse, I like surreal stuff, I like fiction that has a mythological or fantastical or science fiction subject to it, but that's not universally the case. I've read things like, for example, Chuck Palahniuk, like Fight Club, for example. Stuff like Fight Club, or stuff like Irvine Welsh's work, stuff like Douglas Copeland, Generation X. I have been profoundly affected by that material, profoundly affected. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the Yellow Wallpaper, Sylvia Plath's work, Virginia Woolf, all of this stuff, which is actually nothing to do with that. It is not to do with my assumptions of taste, or with the media that principally informed my sense of self. It is actually outside of those assumptions. I've found that to be often the most powerfully moving, the most powerfully traumatic. Like, a very good example, when I first came to Dostoevsky, when I first came to Crime and Punishment completely wrecked my world. It completely wrecked my world. It changed so much in my sense of personality and my assumptions of self, because it completely inverted everything. I thought it was beautiful. It remains one of the best stories about human behavior, about human motivation I have ever read, using as its core subject the notion of a killer, Raskolnikov, who is moved to kill his landlady. But what I find most fascinating about that book is its psychological complexity and its moral complexity, for that matter. Not only is it written principally from the perspective of Raskolnikov, making him the protagonist, it does not belabor itself and it does not shortchange the reader by providing some simplistic Freudian motivation for him. He is still one of the most complex killers in all of fiction. He doesn't know why he does it. He actually can't clearly say, and that makes him fascinating. That makes him so fascinating. Throughout the book, he insists to himself in these internal monologues that he has various justifications and motivations, all of which contradict the other. Sometimes he fancies himself some sort of like academic and social revolutionary, and he's striking a blow against the bourgeoisie for the proletariat, and that because she's a landlady and she's living off of the misery of others, that he's doing a good thing, you know. Other times he does it, he claims that he did it in this delirium, that he was in a state of fever, almost like hallucinatory. He was actually temporarily insane when he did it. And all of these different states of Raskolnikov sort of conflict with one another and don't have any clear outcome. And that is more psychologically complex, and I would imagine psychologically real and accurate than almost any other killer in all of fiction. A very good contrast to that, for me, and one that actually killed stone dead a series I otherwise liked, was Thomas Harris in Hannibal, the book Hannibal. I absolutely hate that book. I absolutely hate it for a number of reasons. But the big one is the fact that it motivates Hannibal. The other books don't. The other books make him this almost fairy tale demon character dropped into a grittily real, sort of socially real world. And that's the core of his appeal. You don't know why he does what he does. And that's what makes him interesting. That's what makes him fascinating. That's the core of his appeal. Whereas Hannibal sets up, the book anyway, I actually prefer the film, the much maligned film, which doesn't have this motivation in it. The book provides this really simplistic Freudian motivation for why he does it. He basically saw his sister, Misha, being cannibalized when he was a kid. And that's what does it. That's why he does it. It's really simplistic, it's cartoonish, it diminishes the character in such powerful ways. I loathe that book. I really, really do. And that's a very good example of the opposite happening. But the fact that a book like Crime and Punishment had such a profound effect on me, and that it inverted my sense of personality, that it actually affected my sense of personality in such a powerful way, that is an experience I think is essential. I think it's something that is too rare, and it only happens when we go outside of our assumptions. It only happens when we expand a little bit beyond what we know we like to experience, what we know we like to read, and we risk being disappointed. That's the big thing. We risk being disappointed or being bored or whatever. It seems to be a problem in postmodern culture, it seems to me at the moment, actually, that we are powerfully afraid of boredom. And we're powerfully afraid of having our assumptions of what we like and what we want upset, it seems. And this is largely a product, it seems, of having this material to hand so easily, thanks to the liberations of technology, the fact that we can just go onto Amazon and we can buy everything we want, or anything we want to read, and we can just wallow in it, we can replay it, we can reread it, we can just go over and over and over it again. It doesn't seem to have the same joy of, say, the sort of childlike exploratory joy of going into a library and finding, like, just seeing a cover that we like, just seeing a name that we like, and just picking that book off the shelf and reading the first few pages and realizing we like it. I found a lot of my favorite writers like that. Like, for example, the writer Billy Martin, who at the time was known as Poppy Z. Bright. I found Billy like that. It was because I was barely employed, just out of university, really struggling to make ends meet, so books being relatively cheap were my principal thing. I used to visit a local bookstore, which was a wonderful bookstore. It's just like a warehouse. It's run by this one old guy. There was no organization to anything. The place was freezing. There were books and boxes of books and stacks of books everywhere, books falling off of shelves, mouldering tomes that had obviously sat there for ages. Real atmosphere, really brilliant bookstore. Nothing was where it should be. It was brilliant. So you got that sense of exploration. I remember going upstairs where it was so cold throughout the year that he had an electric radiator up there because ice would form on things, and where there was a cat that would wander around. And I remember seeing the name on the spine of a hardback book, Poppy Z. Bright, and just because of the name, picking it off the shelf and reading the first story in the collection. It was a story called Self-Made Man, which I think has been renamed since. And the first story in it is the story of a maggot eating through the brain of a philosopher, of a student, and sort of absorbing the memories and the knowledge of that man, but not giving it any particular significance, because he is a maggot and his desire, its function is to eat and to devour. It's brilliant, it's poetic, it's beautiful, it's despairing, it's nihilistic, and that sold me. From that moment on, I have bought everything that Billy has ever written and published. Everything. And just enjoyed every moment of it, every second of it. That was a traumatic moment for me. And trauma is the right term. It's that media that affects you so powerfully that it shocks you, that it kind of traumatizes, it distresses, and it upsets your parameters of taste. I think that is so important, and something I desire. It's something I seek out, and something that I want so much, but it's rare. It is rare, unfortunately, and I imagine gets rarer as you get older. But it is something that we need to teach ourselves again, it seems to me, because it relates back to what I was talking about earlier, which is our assumptions of personality. It allows us to see just how flimsy and protean they are, because it actively transforms them. That exposure actively transforms them. And it allows us, through the exposure to other alien perspectives and contrived other states of being through the characters whose eyes we see through, it allows us to question ourselves and to analyse ourselves, to sort of autopsy ourselves in a way, in the same way we would a work of fiction, which is very apt. That those are the right instruments to use, given the nature of memory that we discussed earlier. Those are the right instruments to use. If you want a utilitarian reason for reading fiction, there it is. It doesn't require that, I don't think, in the same way that beauty or pleasure don't require any kind of justification. They are their own arguments. I think literature and fiction are also their own arguments. They certainly don't require any sort of utilitarian, very sort of capitalist reason to exist or to be enjoyed. But there it is. I don't even know how I started this particular episode, but I've rambled on for long enough now. I hope you've enjoyed it. Look out for the new stuff, by the way. Look out for the new stuff. Look out for... There's more fiction on the way, by the way, as well as Essential Atrocities, short story collection that was published a little while back. There's also going to be 2 short story collections coming from Perpetual Motion Machine, the Born in Blood collections, which I think the more perverse of you out there will enjoy a great deal. So, until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!